A woman has just survived childbirth. The baby is alive, crying, breathing. Relief should flood through her. Instead, terror tightens her chest. The midwife is already wrapping the infant, preparing to rush it to the church. It's winter. The church is freezing. The baptismal font holds ice-cold water. The baby, only hours old, will be submerged 3 times in that water while the priest speaks Latin words. Some babies survive this. Others catch fever and die within days. The mother begs to wait, to let the baby grow stronger, but the church's answer is absolute. Baptism must happen immediately. An unbaptized soul that dies cannot enter heaven. Physical death is temporary. Spiritual death is eternal. So the baby goes to the font and the mother prays it comes back alive. Before we uncover why salvation rituals killed the children they were meant to save, if you're fascinated by how medieval theology created impossible choices between body and soul, subscribe now. The most tragic part is still ahead. Medieval Christianity taught that every human was born carrying original sin, the stain inherited from Adam and Eve's disobedience. This sin condemned the soul to separation from God. Only baptism washed away original sin, opening the path to heaven. Without baptism, a soul could not be saved, regardless of the person's actions in life. For infants who had committed no personal sins, this doctrine created urgency. A baby who died unbaptized was condemned to limbo, a shadowy realm between heaven and hell, where souls existed forever without hope of salvation. Parents couldn't bear this thought. Their innocent child, who had done nothing wrong, would be eternally separated from God simply because water hadn't touched its head while certain words were spoken. The church insisted on rapid baptism, ideally within a day or 2 of birth, certainly within a week. The reasoning was clear. Infant mortality was catastrophic. Babies died constantly from birth complications, infections, feeding problems, or simple weakness. Every hour of delay increased the risk that the baby would die unbaptized. This created the central fear. The baptism ceremony itself posed real physical danger to fragile newborns. Cold churches, freezing water, exposure to winter air during transport, all of these could kill a baby. But refusing or delaying baptism risked something worse than physical death. It risked eternal damnation. Mothers understood the physical dangers intimately. They had watched other babies sicken and die after baptism. They knew the cold water shocked newborns into distress. They saw infants develop fevers, breathing problems, or simply fail to thrive after being baptized too soon. The ceremony that saved souls killed bodies with terrifying regularity. The baptism ritual involved complete immersion in many regions. The baby was held over the baptismal font, a large stone basin filled with water, and dunked 3 times, once for each person of the Trinity. The water was not heated. Even in winter, babies were submerged in water that had been sitting in an unheated church, sometimes cold enough to have ice forming on its surface. Newborns have poor temperature regulation. Their bodies can't generate enough heat to compensate for sudden cold exposure. Dunking a an hours-old or days-old baby in ice-cold water created immediate shock. The baby would gasp, cry desperately, or sometimes go silent and limp. Mothers watching this felt horror, but they couldn't intervene. The priest controlled the ceremony. The church's authority superseded maternal instinct. After immersion, the baby was wrapped again, and sometimes clothed in a white baptismal gown, itself cold and damp. Then the journey home, through winter streets or across muddy village paths, the baby chilled and exhausted. By the time mother and child reunited, the damage was often done. The baby would develop fever within hours, breathing would become labored, and death might follow within days. Parish records document baptisms and deaths in close succession. A baby baptized on Monday, buried on Wednesday. Another baptized Sunday morning, dead by Tuesday night. The pattern repeated endlessly. Families knew baptism was dangerous, but they couldn't refuse it. The church offered no flexibility. Requests to wait until warmer weather, to use heated water, or to perform baptism in the home were generally denied. The sacrament required a church, a consecrated font, and immediate timing. Some progressive priests made small accommodations, warming water slightly or performing the ceremony quickly, but official policy remained rigid. Mothers developed desperate strategies. Some tried to time births to avoid winter baptisms, though controlling conception with that precision was impossible. Others begged for home baptisms during extreme weather. In emergencies, midwives were authorized to perform emergency baptism if the baby seemed unlikely to reach the church alive. Emergency baptism was a terrifying situation. If a baby was born weak, blue, or not breathing properly, the midwife would immediately pour water over its head and speak the baptismal formula. This secured the baby's soul if death came quickly. But it also meant the church ceremony still had to happen later if the baby survived, subjecting the already fragile infant to another ordeal. The theological stakes made compromise impossible. Priests who allowed delays or skipped proper procedure risked their positions. Bishops enforced baptism rules strictly because souls were at stake. A priest who let a baby die unbaptized because he accommodated parental concerns would be held responsible for that soul's damnation. This created a system where everyone understood the physical danger, but felt powerless to change it. Mothers feared for their babies' bodies. Priests feared for babies' souls. The theology won every time because eternal consequences outweighed temporal suffering. Wealthy families had slight advantages. They could afford private chapels with heating, baptismal fonts in their homes, or priests willing to bring warmed water. The ceremony still happened quickly, but conditions were less brutal. Poor families had no such options. Their babies faced the full cold reality of winter baptism in stone churches. The fear mothers felt wasn't irrational or superstitious. It was based on observed reality. Baptism killed babies. Not every baby, but enough that every mother knew the risk. And unlike childbirth, where danger was unavoidable, baptism danger was created by human rules that could theoretically be changed but never were. Some mothers tried to resist. They hid newborns for a few days, claiming complications prevented immediate baptism. They pretended the baby was weaker than it was, hoping to delay. But neighbors watched. Family members pressured. The church investigated delays. Social and religious pressure forced compliance. In cases where mothers genuinely refused baptism, serious consequences followed. The family could be ostracized. The mother might be accused of heresy or witchcraft. The unbaptized child would grow up stigmatized, unable to marry in the church or receive other sacraments. The social costs of refusing baptism were almost as high as the spiritual costs the church claimed. Medieval theology did acknowledge that baptism could be administered in different forms. Immersion was preferred, but pouring water over the head was also valid. Yet many regions continued full immersion because tradition demanded it. The church was slow to adapt practices even when safer alternatives existed within approved theology. Infant deaths shortly after baptism were explained as God's will. The baby's soul was saved, which was the important thing. The body's death was regrettable but temporary. This theological framing offered cold comfort to grieving mothers who watched their babies die from exposure caused by the very ceremony meant to protect them. Some mothers developed deep resentment toward the church over this issue. They fulfilled their religious obligations but couldn't forgive the institution that demanded their babies be risked so brutally. This resentment was rarely voiced publicly, but it appears in private letters, court confessions, and oblique references in personal documents. Others found comfort in the theology itself. They convinced themselves that the baby's soul was more important than its body. If the baby died but was baptized, it was in heaven, which was the best possible outcome. This belief helped some mothers endure the loss, finding meaning in the theology that had contributed to the death. The midwife occupied a complicated position. She helped deliver the baby, witnessed the mother's fear, and often transported the infant to baptism. She saw babies die after baptism and knew the ceremony was dangerous. Yet she had to encourage mothers to comply, because refusing baptism brought even worse consequences. Midwives developed techniques to protect babies during baptism as much as possible. They wrapped infants in extra layers before church, tried to time ceremonies for warmer parts of the day, and stayed close during immersion to warm and dry the baby immediately after. These small interventions couldn't eliminate the danger, but might reduce it slightly. Priests varied in their sensitivity to the physical danger. Some performed baptisms hastily, dunking babies quickly and dismissively, treating the ceremony as routine. Others worked more carefully, minimizing immersion time and showing some concern for the infant's distress. But all were bound by church requirements that prioritized spiritual over physical safety. The comparison to childbirth was stark. Childbirth was dangerous, with maternal mortality rates between 1 and 3% for each birth. But childbirth danger was inherent to biology. Women understood and accepted it as unavoidable. Baptism danger was created by human religious rules. It could theoretically be eliminated or reduced through different practices. This made it more frightening in some ways. The risk was unnecessary but unavoidable due to religious authority. Mothers who lost babies to childbirth complications grieved but didn't feel the same fury as mothers who lost babies to post-baptism illness. One was nature's cruelty, the other was institutional cruelty dressed as salvation. Regional variations existed. In warmer climates, baptism was less dangerous. Mediterranean babies baptized in spring or summer faced minimal risk from cold water, but Northern European babies baptized in winter faced severe danger. The church applied the same rules everywhere, ignoring climate differences. Some heretical movements criticized infant baptism practices, pointing to the deaths as evidence that the church's priorities were wrong. These critics argued for delayed baptism or different practices. The church suppressed these movements violently, seeing them as threats to salvation doctrine itself. Reform movements within the church occasionally addressed baptism practices. Some councils recommended warmed water or faster ceremonies, but implementation was inconsistent, and traditional practices persisted in most regions throughout the medieval period. The psychological impact on mothers was profound. They entered baptism ceremonies in states of high anxiety, torn between religious duty and maternal instinct. They watched their newborns subjected to cold shock and couldn't intervene. If the baby survived, relief mixed with lingering anger. If the baby died, guilt compounded grief. Should they have fought harder to delay? Could they have protected their child somehow? Fathers generally had less involvement in baptism decisions and less emotional investment in the immediate ceremony. They concerned themselves with the theological outcome, ensuring the baby was baptized properly. The physical risk was the mother's concern. This gender divide in baptism anxiety reflected broader patterns where women bore the emotional and physical burdens of child-rearing, while men focused on spiritual and social aspects. Community attitudes reinforced baptism urgency. Neighbors who learned of an unbaptized baby would pressure the family. Gossip spread about families who delayed. Social surveillance made it nearly impossible to avoid rapid baptism even if parents wanted to. The church taught that maternal fear over baptism was itself a spiritual failing. A proper Christian mother should trust God and prioritize her child's soul over its body. Feeling fear or anger about baptism practices suggested weak faith. This teaching added guilt to fear, making mothers feel they were wrong to worry about their baby's physical safety. Why did medieval mothers fear baptism more than childbirth? Because childbirth danger came from nature and couldn't be avoided, while baptism danger came from human rules that chose theology over infant survival. Because they watched babies die from cold shock and exposure after ceremonies that were supposed to save them. Because they understood that the very ritual meant to secure eternal life was ending earthly life for their children. Because the church prioritized invisible souls over visible suffering and demanded mothers do the same. They feared baptism more than childbirth, because childbirth at least made biological sense. Baptism's danger was pure institutional cruelty, unavoidable yet unnecessary, demanded by authorities who would never face consequences for the babies who died shivering in consecrated water. The mothers held their newborns and prayed for two things: that the baby would survive birth and that it would survive being saved. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.